I want to call the September 28th Endicap meeting to order. People listen to me. Yeah. Good. When the key makes the noise. Yeah, key to success. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kate O'Connor, and I'm the chair of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, and I want to welcome everyone here to tonight's meeting. What I'm going to do is have our panel introduce themselves, and we have two new members to our panel. One of them who is here, Representative Laura Sibilia, and she's going to give you a short bio when we get down to her. And the other one who has another meeting this evening but will be here in about an hour is Lissa Weinman, and she was a citizen member appointed by the President Pro Tem of the Senate. And Representative Sibilia was appointed by House Speaker Mitzi Johnson as a member or as a representative of the House Energy and Technology Committee. So we have a full complement now of 19 panel members. I guess we'll start down with Mike McKinney if you want to start the introductions.
Yeah. Good evening, Mike McKinney, Entergy.
Good evening, I'm Jack Boyle. I'm the Decommissioning Director at Vermont Yankee for Entergy.
Hi, I'm Jim Matto. I'm a Citizen Commissioner. I live in Westminster.
Chris Campen, Executive Director, Wyndham Regional Commission.
June Tierney, Commissioner, Department of Public Service.
David Andrews, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Bill Irwin, representing the Agency of Human Services. I work for the Department of Health.
I'm Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon and appointed by the Vernon Select Board.
Laura Sibilia. As Kate said, I serve on the Energy and Technology Committee. I also am a member of the Windham County delegation and have been working on economic development in the region with the Regional Development Corporation.
David Dean, at-large member appointed by the Speaker of the House.
Good evening. My name is Chuck Schwer, and I'm representing the Agency of Natural Resources.
Great, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge that one of our members has left the panel, Jim Tonkovich, who is a citizen appointee from Wilder, and Jim served for 3 years on the panel, and I just want to publicly thank him for all of the work he did. He was always here. If somebody needed to volunteer to do something, Jim always did, so it was much appreciated. And if it's okay with everybody on the panel, I'd like to extend personally to Jim on all of our behalf that we've appreciated his service. When you're a citizen member, you're truly a volunteer, so he did a really good job. Tonight's agenda, and we're supposed to approve minutes, but we've had a minute taker issue. We have a new minute taker, so at the October meeting, we'll be all caught up on our minute issue, hopefully. We're going to have our traditional updates from Entergy in the state of Vermont, and then we have Scott State, the CEO of NorthStar, who's going to go down and or talk to us about the site restoration standards. Then we're going to have a presentation by Geosyntec about the rubblization process, and we will have a discussion per a request in the June meeting from Representative Dean about the documents, protective order documents with the Public Service Department, or Public Utility Commission. What I would ask is everybody to remember that there is going to be opportunity for public comment, so don't worry, we will acknowledge you. And I guess, Joe Lynch, are you ready to go?
Thank you, Kate, and good evening. Next slide, please. Next slide. And one more. Thanks. Okay, I want to start off by providing you with Decommissioning update's been a little while since we've met as a group, as a panel, and work has continued on the primary focus at the site, which is our dry fuel storage project. As I reported in some of the previous meetings, we, of course, had our first ISFC pad, independent spent fuel storage installation pad, installed for a few years, and had loaded a number of casts, 13 casts to date. We then started construction on the second pad back in March, and that went operational on August 14th. So we now have both pads being used at the site to store dry fuel. We started our 2017 cask loading campaign the week of June 11th, and to date we have loaded 12 casks, and we have now 25 completely loaded and stored on both ISFC pads. The 13th cask is in the process of being processed right now, with a target of having that on the pad late tomorrow. And our overall goal is to have all of the fuel transferred to both pads by the end of 2018, and that's pending a number of NRC approvals that we have yet to receive. Next slide, please. A couple current pictures of the facility. The one in the top right shows the completion of the second pad, and it shows a loader getting ready to do the pouring of the concrete in the overpacks as part of the Holtec System 100. The picture on the lower left shows, again, both pads with really the current configuration. I think that's just a couple days ago. So again, on the right-hand side is the existing pad, left-hand side is the brand new pad, and the approach ramp that allows us to bring the equipment onto the pad and store the canisters in place. What you're seeing in those pictures are both completely filled canisters and also ones that are ready to take the inner canister, the multi-purpose canister we call it. And again, that campaign is ongoing right now. Next slide, please. As far as water management, we continue to monitor closely any intrusion water that is coming into the turbine building. We've been reporting on this for nearly 2 years now. We continue with projects to minimize the in-leakage of groundwater, and we've been very successful. The current in-leakage rate is estimated to be about 500 to 600 gallons per day. And if you recall, a year and a half ago, we were getting intrusion rates over 2,000 gallons a day. So the efforts that we've taken to leak seal and to mitigate the intrusion water has been working very nicely. In the meantime, we continue to ship groundwater to Tennessee, to a facility owned by Entergy Solutions. Right now, we're shipping about one tanker per week. Sometimes we go up a bit if we're trying to have additional capacities. We pump down some of the sumps to do some of this repair work. And right now, to date, as of this week, we have shipped 589,000 gallons to the disposal facility for Entergy Solutions. Next slide, please. At the last meeting, I talked a little bit about one of the next major projects that we have at the site, and this is the reduction of the site protected area. So right now, if you were to enter into the Vermont Yankee site, you'll see that the protected area is about a 10.5 acre parcel that is guarded by concrete blocks, fencing, and of course our entire security force and all of the equipment that goes along with that. After we complete the transfer of all the fuel to the second ISFC pad, we will be transitioning to what we're calling a ISFC only protected area. So this will shrink down the area, so it's focused on protecting the fuel, which is the most important thing at that point that we'll have stored on the site. That new installation will have a new vehicle barrier system, new fences, and it'll also have the barrier blocks, cameras, lighting, and then there'll be a standalone building which will house what we call our central alarm station. So that'll have the security officers with all the cameras and things like that. The two primary benefits of reducing the PA, one is it provides better access to the areas that need to have equipment to come into the site to facilitate decommissioning. Currently, any vehicle that enters the 10.5 acre area has to go through a very rigorous security screening. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, so everybody from the trash collector to the person who pumps the septic fields have to use that type of system to go through. By shrinking it down, we'll still have the perimeter fences around the plant, but we'll have a different level of security, and the main focus will be on the area around the fuel. It'll also save the project security costs overall. In order to accommodate this project, we did request Public Utility Commission approval to amend docket 8300, which built the second ISFAC pad. We requested that on May 8th, and we were granted the amendment on August 31st. So now we're moving forward with getting the necessary permits. There's 6 permits necessary to complete the entire project, 4 that we need immediately to actually start the project, and working with the various agencies on that. Implementation of this entire change, the protected area, does require NRC approval because it will change our security plan, which NRC has to approve. And we're looking at a target completion date for completing the entire upgrade by the end of 2018 after all the fuel has been transferred to the 2 pads. Next slide. So this slide shows kind of an aerial view of an artist rendering of what we expect the shrunk down protected area to look like. You see the 2 pads. The one on the right-hand side is the first pad, houses about 40 canisters. The one on the left has a capacity slightly less than that. So this is just kind of gives you an idea. You see we'll have the concrete blocks that'll surround the area. We'll have a perimeter fence and a vehicle access area as well as a personnel access area. You'll see the small building that's kind of at the top of what looks like a shape of a house. That's the central alarm station where we'll have the security folks. And then the structure that's kind of off to the left-hand side with a kind of a white with the orange around it, that's the security diesel generator, which is already installed, that will provide backup power in the event that we lose off-site power. Next picture, next slide, shows kind of another view of how it would look like. But this is something that you will expect the site to look like in a couple of years. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just a couple brief updates on where we stand with the transaction. As you know, there are 2 approvals that are necessary for us to transfer ownership of Entergy Vermont Yankee to the NorthStar Group. One is to seek State of Vermont approval through the Public Utility Commission. That proceeding has been ongoing since December of last year. One of the things that has occurred since the last meeting is a revised scheduling order, and a couple important milestones for everyone is that on January 4th, we have been notified that the next public meeting by the Commission will be held on the 4th in Vernon. I think the location will be the elementary school, but I don't think that's been firmed up yet. As you recall, we had one earlier this year. This will be the second opportunity for the public to come in and make comments and go before the Public Utility Commissioners. And then the technical hearings, which is really what culminates all of the testimony and depositions and discovery that's been done to date, is scheduled for the last 2 weeks in January. And that'll be held also with the Public Utility Commission in Montpelier. A couple of the recent milestones, responses to the petitioner's first round of discovery requests were received yesterday. New England Coalition has a little bit more time, October 6th, to provide theirs. That will feed into all the information leading up to deposition of witnesses. Those are scheduled starting next week for 2 weeks. And then the next milestone is the petitioner's rebuttal testimony, which is due October 17th. A lot of other milestones between now and the actual technical hearings, but everything is now moving along in accordance with the revised scheduling order. Next slide, please. The second approval is, of course, receiving the Nuclear Regulatory Commission license transfer application approval. We filed for the LTA approval back in February on the 9th. We understand the NRC staff is in the process of reviewing the application. During this period of time, the NRC might ask us or the petitioners or the applicants any certain questions that they have through what they call an RAI, request for additional information process. We have not received those to date, but that is something that might be coming along. In the meantime, both the State of Vermont and New England Coalition have filed requests for hearings with the Commission to be more participant in this process. Those were filed in June. The applicants filed their answers to those requests back in July, and now we're waiting for NRC Commission decision on those requests for hearing, and it's always difficult to predict when that'll be, so we're just saying kind of the fourth quarter. Typically, they follow certain schedule guidelines, but the Commission kind of moves at their own pace. So that's where we stand with the NRC proceedings. Next slide, please. And the next. The latest update on the Entergy Nuclear Vermont Yankee Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. Last meeting, we reported that as of May 31st, the trust was at $571.5 million, and the current balance at the end of August is $574.6 million. The increase was due to positive market performance, and that was, of course, offset by the reimbursements that we have taken from the trust. But the summary, I think, is probably the most important thing. So far in 2017, we've withdrawn $22.8 million in qualified withdrawals, but we've received $37.8 million in market gains, so the trust is doing very well. And there's about $2 million thus far this year in fund expenses. The other trust balance that we follow very closely is the Site Restoration Trust. As you recall, as part of the settlement agreement back in 2013, we agreed to fund the Site Restoration Trust to an amount of $25 million over 5 payments. So thus, up to this date, we've so far contributed or funded $20 million. The fund has grown about $4.5 million, and the final payment will be made by the end of December 2017. So again, the Site Restoration Trust performance is doing very well. And next slide, please. We continue our transparent and open communication efforts. Of course, this meeting is a regular way of getting information out and receiving public comments. We also engage in various speaking engagements and work closely with the media on requests. You have seen some local advertising that we've done that provides some information on the transaction, other activities. And we continue to work closely with the community. Our employees still very much live locally and give both their time and money to local efforts, which Entergy can support to the best of our ability. As far as tour for key stakeholders, we did host a tour earlier today for members of the Vermont Department of Public Service and Town of Vernon. We've done tours through the summer for key stakeholders, and we'll continue to do those as requested, as long as it coincides with the work that we're doing at the site and we can allow safe passage while a lot of the ongoing activities are continuing. And then finally, our website, vydecommissioning.com, has been undergoing some revisions and updating. The next page shows a couple of screenshots. We now have all of the latest information that's been put out there in the form of submittals to the various agencies, news and media stories, as well as other publications, including things like these presentations are now up on the website. We're also going back and we're updating some of the titles and references so it's easier to find things. And then finally, we'll have a search function so that people can kind of migrate through the many, many documents that have put on there since we started the website several years back. And that's all I had pending. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Joe. We'll have the state update, and then we'll have open questions for both Joe and the people from the state. And I think what we were going to do is have an update on the CPG process by someone from the Public Service Department, and the Attorney General's office is going to give us an update on the petition to intervene that the state has filed with the NRC. So I guess we have Steph Hoffman.
Thank you, Kate. I'm Steph Hoffman. I'm special counsel for the Department of Public Service, and I'm lead counsel on the Yankee case at the department. I thought I'd focus my comments on the CPG proceedings to discuss a few updates regarding some lingering questions from the June meeting of NDCAP that I know remained after the end of that meeting, and I want to address those this evening, and then I would focus, because I know there's some time later to talk about confidentiality of documents, so I'll defer that to the later portion. I'm not ignoring that question for the time being, but I would like to update everyone on the testimony that the department filed and where we're at in the proceeding as well. So the first update that I will give regarding the outstanding questions from the June meeting, I think that Joe covered a lot of the scheduling progress that we've had since June's meeting. We were having a schedule that was held in abeyance, meaning we didn't know how the proceeding would evolve, but I know that Chris Campany raised the issue of when the public hearing would be in the proceeding, and that has been preserved as a result of the schedule. That January 4th date does preserve a public hearing after all rebuttal and surrebuttal testimony has been filed, so that the case, the substance of the case, both in direct and rebuttal testimony, will have been filed before the community can come together and talk about the information that's been presented to the Public Utility Commission at that juncture. So I know that concern had been raised, and I wanted to address the fact that that had taken place in forming the schedule that exists currently. As Joe indicated, we are preparing now to receive rebuttal testimony from the petitioners in the middle of October, but in the interim, we'll be conducting depositions of all the witnesses in the case who have filed direct testimony, whether that be from the joint petitioners with their petition or by the state's witnesses and other intervening parties' witnesses. And that's going to be taking place the first 2 weeks of October, both in Boston and in Montpelier, depending on the witnesses that we're talking about. During that time, transcripts will be prepared of those depositions, and public versions of those transcripts will be made available shortly after the depositions are taken. They become part of the record, as all the discovery in the case becomes part of has become part of the record as well. I know there were some questions raised at the June meeting regarding NorthStar's ownership structure and how this transaction deals with the issue. I believe a chart that I provided Kate has been passed out to the panel members. I just want to highlight that that is a chart that comes directly out of the department's testimony provided through a witness, consulting witness, Dane. That's page 15 of his testimony. So if individuals have questions about that, I would first offer that the testimony goes into greater detail regarding the ownership structure of NorthStar and how the transaction entities are formed to handle management of the decommissioning process of the plant. The specific question that was asked at the June meeting by, I believe, Senator McDonald was whether or not a NorthStar will be in an LLC corporate structure for management of the plant, and that you can see from the chart is the case. So I wanted to specifically answer that question, and you have that information. And if you have further questions about that, I'll be happy to try to answer them. I know there were a number of questions at the June meeting also raised about the parallel proceedings, and my colleague from the AGO's office, Kyle Landis-Marinello, will speak specifically about what's going on at the NRC, but I just wanted to highlight for people, because I know there's a real question about the issues that have been raised in the NRC proceeding and the issues that have been raised within the CPG context are parallel to one another. There are a number of overlapping concerns that the state, through the various state agencies, have raised in both of those contexts. But I also want to make clear that those two forums are regulated by different sets of regulations at the federal and state level, and so there are different criteria and different objectives that each of those institutions look at when they're analyzing this transaction. And so you may very well see from Bill Irwin's presentation at the June meeting a list of concerns that have been specifically raised by the state agencies in the NRC context, and we're hopeful, and Kyle will elaborate on how those will be handled there. We have raised overlapping concerns, but also separate concerns in the state proceeding because of the criteria that guide that review. And so those proceedings, while influenced by each other and often utilizing expertise in both proceedings, both from ANR, from the department's witnesses, and from the Department of Health, diverge a bit as well. And so the questions that will be raised in each forum are specific to the questions that those fora can actually address. The last question that I think was lingering from the June meeting was regarding past commitments that have been made in various contexts, specifically, I believe the 2013 MOU and settlement agreements are approved in 7862, docket 7862. And I just want to point people's attention to the fact there is a motion pending to the Public Utility Commission that has been filed in this proceeding regarding those issues. There hasn't been a decision rendered about that motion, but certainly, and I want to echo Commissioner Tierney's comments at the June meeting about this, those commitments that have been solidified in other dockets are commitments that exist and are part of the process that we have to consider going forward. They're not commitments that just go away because there is a new proceeding going on. We have to consider those commitments, understand their legal implications for what we're looking at the within the CPG proceedings at the state level, and understand what those commitments mean and how they inform that conversation as we work to litigate this docket in front of the Public Utility Commission. Now I wanted to turn specifically to address the department's testimony that was filed in the proceeding at the end of August, and talk a bit about how that testimony actually reflects on the questions that were asked at June's meeting. We filed specific testimony through department witness Brian Wynn, who's the department's director of finance and economics, and I think his testimony is a great window into the department's position in this docket, the way we're litigating this docket, and how our concerns are framed through the use of various external consulting experts. I wanted to specifically address the concern that the department's testimony would not convey to this panel and to the public a deep understanding because of some of the confidentiality issues that we'll discuss later, because it might be overly redacted or secret in certain ways. Brian Wynn's testimony is 100% unredacted. It is a completely public document that outlines the concerns that were raised by the department, the issues that the department is considering in this docket, and our recommendations at this point in the litigation. And that, I think, evidences, again, Commissioner Tierney's comments at the June meeting regarding our efforts and our position that the public transparency in this docket is absolutely essential. Bringing in parties who can participate meaningfully, understand the docket without signing on to all of these sorts of agreements that we'll discuss later. And so I hope that that testimony, just as a document, memorializes those concerns, a response to those concerns, that it evidences our efforts to make our understanding clear to the reading population. So that's just a sort of step back to say that that's a fully public document and our rationales are conveyed in it. Mr. Wynn does identify the 3 consulting experts that offer testimony for the department. As I mentioned, Dane, who you have an excerpt from his testimony from Concentric, deals with the financial capacity of NorthStar and the financial capacity of Entergy, and compares the two in his testimony to outline the advantages and risks that he and his firm have assessed regarding this transaction. The department has also utilized Warren Brewer and Greg Merritt's testimony and report that they've drafted in this docket to talk about the work that's necessary at the Vermont plant prior to the conveyance from Entergy to NorthStar, should it happen, the work that NorthStar would have to complete to decommission according to their plan, and the potential risks associated with that work. And some of you who have been involved in this process for a while will recall that Mr. Brewer and Mr. Merritt had provided testimony in prior dockets as well. Mr. Wynn's testimony also seeks to compare NorthStar's proposal to the proposal that the status quo would offer, meaning if Entergy carried forward in safe store and decommissioned at a later date versus the decon proposal that NorthStar has offered. In order to evaluate this transaction, Mr. Wynn does identify the criteria that the Public Utility Commission has used in the past to evaluate financial transactions of this type, and that is how he approaches outlining the department's recommendations. And those criteria have been specifically identified in a transaction of this type as 3 things. 1, whether this financial transaction evidences technical and managerial competence, i.e. does NorthStar have the technical competence to carry forward with this transaction and decommission the plant. 2, whether or not NorthStar has the financial strength and soundness to do that work. And 3, what is the reputation and conduct of that company that we'd be considering a financial transaction of this sort? Asked another way, will NorthStar be a fair partner to the state of Vermont? And in conclusion, at this point in the process and with the information that Mr. Wynn has analyzed and the department has come together through Mr. Wynn to convey in this proceeding, he identifies a number of risks in his testimony that are still outstanding in his mind. This, again, utilizes the testimony of the other experts and his own analysis. And then he presents some financial inquiries that the department is still conducting into this transaction. So at this juncture, he poses a series of questions, essentially, regarding the transaction and says that at this point, we need more information and we need answers to these outstanding issues. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Kyle for an NRC update.
Good evening. I'm Kyle Landis-Marinello. I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Environmental Protection Division at the AG's office. Not much to report on the NRC proceeding. I think you had a pretty extensive presentation on it at the last meeting. This is a separate proceeding from what's going on at the Public Utility Commission. Has been mentioned a few times, Entergy and NorthStar need approval from both the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Public Utility Commission. The matter has now been fully briefed. So at the time of June meeting, the state, and that's the AGO, the Attorney General's office, along with the Public Service Department, and with substantial help from the Agency of Natural Resources and the Health Department as well, had filed this request for a hearing. We raised 2 contentions that we're hoping to address at a hearing. The first one is essentially whether NorthStar will have enough money to fully clean up this site. The second is whether additional environmental review is needed before this transaction can be approved. Since that initial filing, Entergy and NorthStar responded, and then the state did a reply filing. The New England Coalition has also asked to intervene in this proceeding. They've filed 2 contentions, one arguing the application that's been put forward is incomplete, the second arguing that more site investigation is needed here. So we're just waiting at this point to get a ruling on whether our 2 contentions and the New England Coalition's 2 contentions will be heard by a hearing officer. The state is obviously hoping that we are granted a hearing. We think that's an important step in this process to fully vet this deal and make sure that the financial assurances and environmental protections that we need to protect Vermonters are going to be there. When the decision comes out in the next few months, it will either grant a hearing, which starts a pretty quick clock going at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I believe that hearing has to take place within 65 days of the issuance of the decision granting the hearing, or if the contentions are all denied and no hearing is granted, then there's an appeal route available to the commissioners. So that's where we're standing on the NRC proceeding.
Thank you, Kyle. And I want to thank Steph. She quickly went to her seat before I was able to say thank you. So thank you. And I don't know if there's anyone else from the state that wants to give us an update on anything at this moment. Tony.
Okay. Okay. Wait, is this on? Okay. I couldn't quite tell if you could be if I could be heard. Just very briefly, I was just the past 2 days I've been attending the National State Liaisons Officers Conference with the NRC, and just one item I know that has been of significant interest to this panel is an update on the schedule for decommissioning rulemaking. So I just have some notes that I'm reading off of to remind myself here. At the present time, the draft regulatory bases, which were issued earlier this year on May 15th, there was an open comment period which ran through June 13th that the state did file a number of comments on. The comments we filed were largely based on the comments that we had filed on the original anticipated notice of rulemaking back in March of last year. So in any case, the NRC is still sifting through the public comments that they received, and they have indicated that they will, in their final product regarding the regulatory bases, that there will be responses to all of the comments that have been provided. They anticipate that they will complete working through the comments by the end of October, at which point they expect that the final bases document for the regulation will be issued sometime in mid-November of this year. The next step on that and the next opportunity to comment will then come with the draft rulemaking and the draft guidance, which is expected to come out in May of 2018. At that time, hold on, just let me check my notes here a second. Yes, the proposed rules and the draft regulatory guidance will be open for both commentary from the NRC commissioners and from the public as well. And they have committed to a 75-day public comment period. So anticipate that sometime in May we'll have another opportunity to comment on the rulemaking, and we'll have 75 days to do so. All of this schedule is still supporting a final issuance of rules to the commissioners in late 2019. They are right now the NRC is saying fall of 2019, with the commissioners most likely taking action sometime in 2020. There will be more information coming out on that, but that's what effectively what the NRC reported. So.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. Does anyone in the panel have any questions for either Joe, Tony, Kyle, or Steph? Yes, David Dean.
Question for the department's attorney. You mentioned that there's a motion relative to the MOUs. You did not say who has made the motion and what the issue is for the motion.
Happy to do that.
Thank you.
So NEC filed a motion that is a peculiarity of the Rules of Civil Procedure, 60B, requiring the PUC to issue an order as to whether or not the petitioners in this case needed to reopen the past dockets in order to make the requests that they're specifically making in this matter, meaning does this request by joint petitioners so severely implicate what has been committed to in the past in a way that requires the PUC to reopen that docket in order to make a decision regarding these issues, or can this exist as a separate and contained proceeding that is informed by that past docket?
And the outcome, if it says yes, then the previous docket where the MOUs were memorialized is reopened? I mean, that could be one of the outcomes?
That's the request that NEC has made. So if that request were granted in full then by the commission, then yes, that could be an outcome.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'm lost. I don't understand the explanation. Apparently there's something can go one way or the other way. Could you put into English what the two ways are?
There are more than two options for the commission in this case. I could try to give you a spectrum of options, but there could be different points that the commission makes a decision on this motion. The direct request by NEC was that the New England Coalition, they're an intervening party in this docket, and they filed this motion asking the commission to reopen docket 7862 specifically, which had the MOU that Representative Dean had inquired about at the June meeting, and settlement agreement accompanying it as part of the final order in that case. And NEC's argument is...
Remind us of which case that was.
So that's the case that dealt with the closing of the plant.
Okay. So when the plant was closed, everybody pretty much understood what was supposed to happen. A period of time was going to take place, and the decommissioning would take place when there was enough money available. Now we have a new situation, and the question is, do we get a hearing on the new situation, or is it a continuation of the old MOU to be modified? Is that?
That is the basis of NEC's request here. The basis of the request is, does this new proceeding require that the commission, look back at that old case and reconsider it? Or is this just a separate proceeding that can go forward without that inquiry, that can stand on its own?
So Madam Chair, a question that we had left hanging several months ago was, if what we have before us as a proposal, we go along with it, and it turns out that there wasn't enough money, the question was, who's left holding the bag? So the decision on this hearing kind of deals with that question, doesn't it?
The question for the commission to answer in this proceeding is certainly whether the financial capacity exists for NorthStar to carry forward with the decommissioning of the plant as per the terms it's proposed, meaning decon as opposed to safe store.
But we still have not been told what the underlying procedure, rules, etc. are in the event that NorthStar takes this over and fails. Who at that point is left holding the bag?
And that's a question.
That actually wasn't my question. That was your question. Good question. Ask it. My question was, would those MOUs stand relative to the standard of cleanup? In other words, just because we have a new owner and we may have a new decision, do those MOUs about the cleanup of the site to our environmental standards stay in place? And if the MOUs stand, then fine. I would be comfortable with that because of the standards that were put in place relative to what the agency will expect in terms of bringing that site back to a greenfield. And so my question is a little narrower, Senator, than yours. If I could go to my second question quickly.
Sure.
I may have missed it, but I am suddenly, after your presentation, very interested in reading Mr. Wynn's testimony. Can we circulate that?
Yes, I can. But Steph and I, she'll tell me where to find it, and then I'll make sure everybody gets the link to it.
Thank you.
Right. We're going to have it. Just one sec. I want to make sure everybody on the panel. Okay, just hold on one sec.
So actually, I have a question for Mr. Lynch, or two questions.
Okay, right there.
Just a general comment before my questions. I know it's your report, but for a couple of years now, I've seen these reports that are on single page. It would be great if we double-sided these and cut the number of pages in half.
Thank you. I'll make sure that happens next time.
Great, thank you. So my specific questions are related to the new site protected area, the ISFSI only protected area. The first is regarding the new protected area. I'm looking at the overhead view of the two pads, and the space that's available on the second pad reminded me of the possibility that there could be a need in the future to remove the canisters from their storage conditions now into something different. For example, if the license on the current Holtec canisters will not be given extension, or if there are even additional requirements for the transport of these spent fuel canisters. Does this new protected area, as it's configured there, provide the space that would be needed if there were to be some sort of transition or other kind of activity related to movement of the fuel from these canisters to other canisters?
First, I think the artist renderings are just that, artist renderings as opposed to engineering renderings. Generally speaking, when you load the pads, there is room on the pads for shuffling the canisters, accessing ones in the back row, for example. I don't know what the final configuration is going to look like, but chances are we won't have all 40 on the first pad, and then the balance will be on the second pad. There will be room for shuffling. So that will allow us to move around the canisters to do maintenance, if you will, if necessary. But if there is an effort in the future to offload the fuel from these storage configuration and be transported to either an interim storage or a final federal repository, there would have to be a facility constructed to do that. And that's kind of in concept right now. Obviously, we're not going to build something like that until such time we know that transferring the fuel is a reality. But moving them from the pad to some sort of transfer facility would be necessary to load them into the certified transporter and send them by truck, rail, or other transportation to Yucca Mountain or some other facility in the future.
And are those costs captured in the original site-specific cost estimate for the post-shutdown decommissioning activity report, and are they captured in the NorthStar post-shutdown decommissioning activity report site-specific cost estimate?
I'd have to look that up for you. I don't know how those costs were in the estimate, but certainly something I can research and provide back to Kate to give an answer to the entire panel.
Great, thank you. And then the other question is related to the same reduction in the security area, and that's the transition from having nuclear fuel as the primary security concern to a certain area, and then all of the rest of the plant that you're going to have better access to because you're shrinking that protected area. There are still security requirements for the other structures that are going to be removed out of the protected area as you shrink it. And obviously that's because there are still going to be probably Category 1 and Category 2 sources of radioactive material within the structures there, like the reactor building and the rad waste building, et cetera. Is it possible that you could provide the panel with some sort of description of what that security would be like for those remaining structures? Because I think while we're all very interested in what the security for the fuel will continue to be, we're also still going to have great concerns about the security for those other structures, since the protected area that we've all been relying on for a very long time is shrinking away from them.
Sure. So I'll ask Jack to help me out if I don't describe this correctly, but we will still have the exterior fencing and barriers in place, even though they will have a lesser security requirement than the fuel. But we will not allow people on site without going through the same access points that we've established. There still will be badging, and people will have to have the right credentials. So if we transitioned from kind of where we are right now to a NorthStar described earlier decommissioning. There would still be a requirement for vehicles and the people who are working on site to go through that now lesser security, but we won't let people, onto the site to, kind of do whatever they want, respecting that there is sources, as you described, in areas that we have to have controls over, dosimetry, things like that. So it's a kind of a lesser security, but it's still, with the right controls, makes it a little bit more amenable for equipment to kind of move in and off the site, and people as well. And overall, it'll save us some costs that right now we have to incur.
Thank you.
Yeah, Joe, one thing I'd add to that, and Bill, your request to provide the panel with some information for that additional part of the plant that's outside the ISFISI only PA. It's in a different part of the NRC's regulations, so we can work with our security manager and we can provide what's in that regulation. I think that's what you're asking for.
Yeah, that would be part 37, yes.
Part 37, correct. Yep.
Kate?
Yes.
Might I add just a couple comments to Joe's related to those questions. As far as the ISFISI pad is concerned, and some open real estate.
Put your mic on, just push the button.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
As far as the ISFISI pad and open real estate, in the decommissioning process, I think you're aware that there are going to be 2 or 3 canisters of greater than Class C waste created. So while there may look to be space at the inception while all the fuel is on the pad, there's a requirement for some space specifically for that purpose. And that material, under the definitions that DOE has created, is considered high-level waste, although it's not actually high-level waste. And it's their responsibility to dispose of that material. So that, in fact, is, I think, why that rendering would show some space at the completion of fuel move. To one of your other questions, you asked about whether we had carried the cost of loading, essentially, I think is what you were getting to, of the canisters for DOE. And yeah, we're aware that's our expense. That's a cost we have, and it's not a reimbursable cost from the DOE. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I want to move on to our next topic, and I know that the public has some questions, and if it's okay, if we can get back to that discussion at the end, because I don't want us to get too far behind. Next up, we have Scott State, who is the CEO of NorthStar, for all of those who do not know, but he's been here quite often. And he's going to talk to us about the site restoration standards, and it's actually a topic that we are very happy that you're discussing with us, because we've been waiting a long time.
And I'm not going to make a lengthy presentation. I think this is an area that is ripe for public input, and I think a lot of the discussion that's occurred so far this evening really is geared towards site restoration standards. And the key elements of site restoration standards are on page 4. Should we move back to that, please? And as you look at these, there's the obvious things like complying with regulations, getting approvals, establishing criteria that really define what is done, looking at the end use of the property, future monitoring to make sure that the decommissioning project that was done was in fact successful. All of those things go into creating the scenario from the first picture, which is the existing plant, to the last picture, which is a site that's been released for unrestricted use. And I want to say that we're not proposing in the last picture that this be a solar site. We've heard from a number of people that might not be what everyone's objectives are. But our objective here is pretty simple. We expect to clean this site up. We expect to do it in a safe and compliant manner and deliver a site that's not impaired. It's not a brownfield site. It's a site that can be redeveloped and used for other purposes. And to that end, that's the basis on which we've proposed site restoration standards. So switching to page 5, our transaction is contingent on, among other things, agreement with the PUC on what those site standards would be. And I have a feeling that there are a number of people here in the audience who might have some input on what they think the standards should be or could be. And I'm going to be very happy this evening to address those as best I can. But what we've generally done here is propose standards that will be compliant with state and federal regulation. In addition to that, looking specifically at what the end use of the property would be, what kind of radiological dose limits we would expect, and I'll get into that a little bit in a little bit more detail, how we model that dose, and then also non-radiological criteria associated with the site, and dealing with things that are in the subsurface. And I think, Kate, you mentioned you've got a consultant here to speak to things like rubblization or recycle and reuse, and I think that'll kind of dovetail into some of the things I talk about there. So as far as end use of the property, we're proposing that the site be remediated and cleaned to a light industrial or industrial use. I know there's been some question as to whether the site could be redeveloped for residential use, and at this point in time, when we look at this project, the site's going to have spent nuclear fuel on it, and we don't see it as a likely scenario that it would be developed into any kind of residential activity in the near term. So our proposal is to is to clean the site to an industrial standard. We've proposed a 15 millirem per year exposure rate, and some might say, what does that mean? Well, the site itself is a former nuclear power plant. We are going to decontaminate structures in the subgrade, and we're proposing to use clean aggregate or clean rubbleized material to fill void spaces. And that process evaluated with analytical models that look at all the materials that are going into that area under what's called a basement fill model will be done in a way where we calculate the dosage to a person that essentially lives on top of the worst place on the site. They're a farmer, they raise livestock, they drink water from the ground, they eat the meat from the livestock they raise, and the standard as it's applied via the NRC is one in which that person would not receive more than 25 millirems per year of dose of radiation. We looked at that standard, and we looked at other regional projects and concluded that we could do better than that, and we've proposed that we would meet a standard of 15 millirem per year, so some 40% less exposure than the federal standard would be. As far as non-radiological cleanup criteria, we've based our proposal on the 2012 IROC-P. I believe there's a new revision of that out just in the last couple of months. We would expect to review that document, confirm any differences from the 2012 version, and in fact comply with the current regulations that exist as of the closing of the transaction. As far as subsurface structures and piping, we're proposing that we remove foundations at the site to a level of 4 feet below grade. That would generally be below the frost line for the site, and in our experience, consistent with these type of projects in other places. That would include removal of structures below that level if those structures are contaminated. One of the things that we've heard from folks is that there's a concern that we're going to take clean aggregate, clean rubble from the site and somehow blend it with contaminated material and create a somewhat contaminated fill material. And that's not our intention, that's never been our proposal, and that's not what we would do. But our experience is that using recycled materials on these sites generally makes a lot of sense. I think there's also been some concern that doing this has some financial gain for us, and it's really not the situation. The process of segmenting, surveying, decontaminating is expensive, and generally it's no real significant cost benefit to do that. The probably more overlying consideration here is moving materials on and off the site. And we can move materials off with rail, but we have to move material back on with trucks. And we're looking at some 3,000 to 5,000 loads of material that would have to come to the site if we take what is clean material from the site and ship it off somewhere else. So it's, you know, it's our interest to get input from the public, certainly input from this board, input from the PUC, the DPS, the ANR, and the AG's office. We believe there's a win-win here. We you know, have made a proposal. We've been here now a number of times and explained, I think, what it is we want to do. The process, as it's been described, is now into a phase where we've got depositions, and in the near term, I know there will be hearings, and we look forward to the continued engagement with the local community.
Great, thank you. What we're going to do is first take questions or comments from the panel, and then we will open it up to the public. So I don't know if there's anyone. Jim.
Hi, thank you, Scott. I just have a couple of questions because I just want to be sure I heard clearly. I did see on on page 6 you mentioned, and it states clearly that the proposal is to have the property released for industrial use. And I thought I heard you say on the first slide that had the pictures of the current site and one proposed use at the end, I thought I heard you say unrestricted use. And that's two different things.
Okay. The release of a site under NRC rules and regulations for unrestricted use is I think a term of art specific to the NRC, and you know, in the regulatory framework, it's released for unrestricted use in terms of its current use as a licensed facility under the NRC. So that's specifically what that means. It's unrestricted in any way related to its prior radiological status.
But it's not unrestricted in terms of its future use.
I think it would be unrestricted. We just aren't looking at this site specifically as a residential opportunity.
Well, I think what might be misleading, it's misleading to me, and I don't mean that you're trying to mislead me, but the terms are misleading in that if I'm told the goal is unrestricted use, but you wouldn't be able to live there, that's kind of restricted.
Well, I wouldn't say you wouldn't be able to live there. I'm just not sure people would want to live there. And maybe that difference is a mistake on my part in considering this. But you know,
no, I don't think so. I mean, we hear the term unrestricted a lot, and I think it's probably just unfair to the English-speaking public and not the technical people what that means. But you do say on page 6 that your goal is industrial use. So if another party said they wanted unrestricted use, that needs to be cleared up.
Yeah, I can't sit here tonight and tell you that that site would not be able to be used for residential use. It's just been our expectation as we've gone through this process that the site, being an industrial type facility today, would continue to be used in that type of manner.
Yeah, okay.
Could the area be used for residential housing? I believe it could. You'd have to deal with, you know, I guess the stigma of a lot of spent nuclear fuel at the ISFAC.
Yeah. Well, my other question is, when you talked about subsurface structures and to a depth of 4 feet below existing grades, did you reference that? Not in writing here, but did you say something there about that being frost line?
Yeah, I said that you know, in a lot of places that would be considered frost line. It's not 4 feet because of frost line,
Right.
but frost line here I'm sure could be significantly different than that on a nice cold
the year before
Vermont
last,
winter.
several villages in Vermont had their water mains freeze.
Yeah.
And those were well below 4 feet.
Yeah.
And that was a real problem. I mean, again, they're not going to put a water main in there, but
Right.
yeah, 4 feet. Okay. Thanks.
I'm wondering if you could put into context this 15 millirem. This is 15 millirem above and beyond the background radiation, is that right? And can you sort of characterize what that percentage would be of background radiation?
background radiation, as I'm sure you're likely aware, is a function of where you are in the world or in the United States. In the Northeast, where you've got a lot of material, a lot of granite, background here is actually pretty high. I don't recall specifically, what the average background would be in New England, but I'm guessing it's well over 100 millirem per year from all sources, from cosmic, from the Earth, from everything around you. 15 millirem per year, therefore, would be, say, 10 to 15% of that normal background amount. And you're correct, that is in addition to normal background, the amount of calculated potential radiation exposure. We're not looking at doing this in a way where that would be the absolute exposure. Remember, the modeling we use assumes that all the worst potential scenarios come together. There's a resident farmer and he's growing food and eating it. That's the case that you would get to, and I think that's analytically, whether that's a good or bad thing, why the NRC has developed a standard in that way. It's all at this point done with analytical models and generally with a computer program called ResRad that's been used now for many of these types of projects in the past.
Okay. And so the average worker, let's say, at an industrial facility there, in contrast with the resident farmer, would be likely, working there 40 hours a week, would be likely to get a lot less dose than the 15 even.
Yeah, I believe that the modeling can actually be done to calculate that, but yeah, my expectation is it would be close to zero.
Right. My other question has to do with the use of the rubble as fill. If for whatever reason it was decided that all of that rubble had to be trucked away, wouldn't the clean fill that would come back in, so quote unquote clean fill, consist of possibly a lot of rubble from other places?
Well, it would be rubble from other places. The material that we're looking at moving off the site, and I want to emphasize, that material would be both sampled in a laboratory and surveyed to confirm that it's clean within the requirements that we have. It wouldn't be blended with other material that is contaminated. But yeah, yes, in fact, it's a little bit different than that. We would move that material from the site by rail. We are developing, as part of the early stages of the project, or we will be developing rail that used to be present at the site. And we will use that rail to make shipments of that material off the site. We don't have a rail tipper on the site, so we would not be importing material by rail. That material would be trucked in. So the material wouldn't leave by truck, but new material would have to come back by truck. And I think, people have used the example, well, you could take material from the site and then you could take, other material from the Pilgrim site outside of Boston and bring it and put it there. That, in fact, within the current agreement would be acceptable. And so we just don't see the common sense in that kind of an approach, for obvious reasons.
Thank you.
Just a quick clarifying question. Under the current agreement, which agreement are you referring?
I'm referring to the agreement that I believe was being referenced over here, the prior settlement agreement. My general understanding is that the terms of that are that no rubble from the site could be used at the site, but it didn't specifically exclude, obviously, rubble from somewhere else, and it wasn't specific to anywhere that would be objectionable. That's my understanding. I'm obviously not party to any other agreement.
Okay. The question I actually have a question for A&R. Under any state rules related to industrial sites, is unrestricted use defined legally any place in state statute or regulation, or is that solely an NRC term of art or term of law or regulation?
I'm not an expert on that. I would say probably not. The term we use in our Sorry, the term we use in our state-of-the-art would be the standards that we set, and it was mentioned the IROC, that was a procedure which has now been turned into a rule, and in that rule we have standards for soil contamination, for non-radiological waste, and we have industrial, commercial, or residential. So I would consider non-restrictive to be residential standards, not industrial.
The reason I'm asking is, and maybe this is something we can agree on going forward, is just that we have a common understand. I know what you're talking about from the NRC unrestricted use, and then but as we're talking about, we've got multiple procedures going on. So if we could just kind of come up with our, well, I guess it'd be a lexicon about what we mean by different standards, so we make sure that we're all on the same page when the terms are getting used.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. There's different nomenclature typically used for radiological and non-radiological, and the terms don't really line up in a lot of circumstances. So that's a good point.
And can I
Mr.
clarify
Irwin?
one thing?
Yeah.
What you're talking to us tonight about are the site restoration standards you're proposing to the Public Utility Commission.
That is correct,
Right,
Kate.
so this would not be residential standard that you're talking about tonight. It would be industrial, based
Yes.
on. So
I believe we're consistent on that.
Yeah, it's industrial standards that we're talking tonight. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the way I understood his presentation, light industrial.
Okay, good. Just want to clarify.
Just a kind of clarification on this term unrestricted and restricted use. That is, those are terms used purely by the NRC for radiological purposes. A site that's released for unrestricted use can be used for any purpose, no matter how you would call it, in any other kinds of perspectives, including, for example, hazardous wastes perspectives. And there's, by definition, no limitation on what new user could use that property for. So that term should not be mixed with thoughts about non-radiological conditions there at the site. And then a reason that I bring that up is that the NRC does define restricted use, and restricted use is to much higher dose limits than is unrestricted use. So I hope that we can, as was suggested, have an agreement as to what terms there are, how they're used, and that one in particular we should clarify is purely radiological, from my understanding.
I agree with that. I think that's an excellent point.
Senator McDonald. Oh, you have to pass the mic down, please.
Is there being a proposal to lower the standard and make and do the job on the cheap compared to how Vermonters believed it was going to be done when these original deals were dealt with, when we knew what Maine Yankee was and Connecticut Yankee was?
Do you want? The question is, what were the standards in Maine Yankee when that was cleaned up in relation to what you're proposing?
We can ask the expert. Mr. Smith, are you in the crowd? Could you speak to that? This gentleman was at Maine Yankee.
If you could come up to the mic here so we can, and if you want it.
Madam Chair,
yeah.
I don't need an answer to that question today. That's a question we ought to ask ourselves.
If there's somebody here that can answer the question, and if you want to just tell us who you are, that would be helpful.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Todd Smith, resident of Maine. Worked at both, all three, Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, and Yankee Row. And the specific standards, cleanup standards at Maine Yankee was, they referred to it as 10-4. So 10 milligram cleanup criteria, 4 to groundwater. So it was put into a model similar to the model that Mr. State is speaking of this evening, and agreed upon by the state, and we cleaned up to that criteria at Maine Yankee. I do not recall specifically the cleanup criteria at Connecticut Yankee, but I believe it was very similar to the 15 millirem criteria
I believe it
that
was.
Mr. State is speaking of tonight.
Great.
Non-radiological, I cannot answer that. I apologize.
Great. Thank you for letting us put you on the spot.
You're very welcome.
Does anyone else on the panel have any questions? No. Oh, Laura. Pat.
You'll forgive me, new girl here. Just a question with regard to the industrial versus residential. You had said that it would be unlikely, and I know you spoke about stigma, but what factors would make it more likely for residential use versus industrial?
I think there's probably more than one answer to that. Certainly space is an issue. So if you wanted to take a remote part of the site and develop it for some residential purpose, that likely could be done in the near term. Certainly the removal of the spent fuel would be a great way to make the site fully usable for a lot of different purposes. I think both of those would be workable solutions.
So can I just follow up? So the standard we're looking at, I just want to make sure I understand this, is to industrial as opposed to residential. And so those are the only factors that go into determining that, or whether or not the spent fuel is still on the site and the space?
Well, again, this is where we get into this dichotomy. From a radiological perspective, the site would be released for unrestricted use. From a gross IROC standard, we've looked at the site being released for industrial use because we believe that was the likely end use. I'll have to tell you, I can't speak directly to any incremental cost or difference in the way the end state of the project would be if we in fact said we want the site released for residential use. I believe we've probably looked at that. I'm just not personally, sitting here tonight, familiar enough with that to give you an answer.
Okay. Thank you.
We have time for one more panel question. Yes.
So I just happen to have a copy of the settlement agreement, and so I was curious about the standards that were in the settlement agreement, and in particular related to rubblization, given the questions about that tonight. And I thought I would just read it quickly because it is actually pretty brief. So it says that EVY shall not employ rubblization at the VY station site, open parentheses, i.e. demolition of an above-grade decontaminated concrete structure into rubble that is buried on site, close parenthesis.
Thank you. What I want to do now is open the floor for questions or comments from the public. And what I would ask is anyone who has a question or a comment to come over to the microphone, and for so we all know who you are, and for the minutes, if you want to give us your name and where you are from. Yeah, please come up. Oh, yes, you do. It captures it for the television, in addition to letting us all hear.
That was a word modifying above-ground structure. So if it was not contaminated, it could be rubbleized and remain on site.
The way that I read the clause, that rubblization is not allowed, and that rubblization means demolition of an above-grade decontaminated concrete structure into rubble that is buried on site. So that would be taking parts of the structures that are there, decontaminating them, or they were in that state already, and rubblizing, breaking them apart and burying them on site, which tends to be in disagreement with the.
Contaminated does not fit, right? In other words, they could be rubblized and used on the site.
Right, if it was proven never to have been contaminated.
Take the hunt house, stomp it down, and bury it if you could.
That's clearly one way that could be interpreted, I believe.
I think from our perspective, we wouldn't want to try to parse sentences like that. I understand both points of view. I would prefer that we simply propose what we want to do, we discuss it, and there's an agreement in clear English as to what that means, and we move forward on that basis. There's certainly some ambiguity there.
And plus, this is an issue that's the NEC has raised with the Public Utility Commission anyway. Not that specific issue, but the MOU. Yes.
I may be able to answer one of your questions on roll mass anyway. When they decommissioned that, they ran into
could you tell us who you are?
My name is Bob Leach. Most people already know who I am, one way or another. When they decommissioned Yankee Roll, they ran into some very unique problems, and they worked very closely with the state of Massachusetts. I'm not 100% sure of the terminology, but I know in the end they classified it as a brownfield. They could not get it to what they called a greenfield, if that's any help to you. I think their unique problem was the paint that was used at Row outside was done back in the 50s and contained a lot of PCB, and that containment, rain all washed down, and from what I understand, they just couldn't get it cleaned up. So if that helps you out any. I didn't hear anything about Connecticut, Yankee, or Maine.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Skylar Gould. I'm with the New England Coalition. I wanted to address, Mark, your question and our motion before the Public Utilities.
Can you like pull the mic up just a little? Thanks.
Our motion in front of the Public Utilities Commission, as I believe I understand it, in docket 7862. NorthStar proposes changing several different aspects, several different terms of that agreement. And it's New England Coalition's contention that in order to change anything that's major, and we suggest that rubblization is a major, the agreement to not rubblize is a major change, that you can't pick and choose items out of a docket and change those as a whole separate hearing. You need to reopen the entire docket, which would allow us to review all the conditions of that docket as it was originally proposed. Also, I should say that the Public Utilities Commission's regulations suggest that that is necessary if there are any major changes. I wanted to ask Mr. State if he knows of any decommissioned sites that have actually been used for industrial use while high-level waste is still stored on the site. Do you know of any sites in the country?
I don't know of any in the U.S. That have been reused for generally any purpose. I think most of the sites have continued to be owned by utilities. One or two may have actually repowered with fossil, but I'm not familiar specifically with that.
Thank you. You mentioned the monies that would be saved by being allowed to rubblize and bury the concrete on site. Those monies have not been included in your current financial proposal? those savings are not included in your current proposal?
No, I believe what I stated was that there was not significant savings from rubbleizing material due to the fact that you're now crushing material to 3-inch minus, you're surveying it, you're sampling it, and there's additional material handling. There's, I think analytically we would think there's a small savings, but logistically it's frankly easier to leave it in large pieces and ship it for disposal. So there's not, a life cycle cost analysis, a significant savings at all from rubbleizing material.
Can I ask, I'm curious, why rubbleize? Why not, if you're going to leave it on site, and because rubblization obviously exposes much more surface area to the elements, rainwater flow, possibly getting into the, why does it need to, why would it be rubbleized and not buried in large chunks, which would slow down the decomposition rate and presumably the hazards to the environment?
I'm not an expert in crushed aggregate. I know it's industry standard, industry practice to do that. I think one of the issues with not rubbleizing the material to a relatively small diameter is that over time the material, if left in large pieces, you have significant void spaces that don't get filled, and you have settling and issues like that. But I think I'm assuming the speaker you've brought to address that specifically can probably answer that question for you. I'm not a geotechnical expert.
I want to give anybody else the opportunity to ask a question if they have one. So do you have one last quick one? Because we need to go to a break in a minute too.
Okay, thank you. You're suggesting that there would be 3,000 to 5,000 truckloads of material that would have to be brought in. Over what period of time would those truckloads of material be brought in?
Probably roughly a year. I mean, it would depend how we sequence the work. Recall in looking at the site, you've got two large void spaces to fill. You've got where the reactor building is, and that's to 50 feet roughly. You've got where the turbine building sits, where the condenser is below the turbine, that's to 30 feet. So it would get down to sequencing of whether you filled one space while you were working in the other, or just how you would do that.
Okay. We have to move. I have to move along.
Okay, thank you very much.
We would love to have more time for questions, but we don't.
I have one more question.
One more, and then we have to.
If this transaction is allowed to go forward, is there any legal reason that you know of why NorthStar couldn't revert to the 100 millirem residual radioactivity, which is allowed for industrial sites?
Yes. The standard you're referring to is a standard for restricted use. The meaning of us agreeing to release the site for unrestricted use, and specifically agreeing or proposing at this point in time, but saying we would agree to a 15 millirem per year standard, would specifically preclude what you're describing as a 100 millirem per year dose rate. That's not in our plan, that's not our intention, and we're certainly willing to document that in any agreement we might make with the state.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Scott, I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'm sure you'll be back again.
I hope so.
Yeah, you'll hopefully be back again. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back at 1:15 exactly so that we can keep on schedule. So thank you. I want to introduce our next presenter, Doug Larson, who is with Geosyntec Consultants. And I really want to thank Doug and Mike McKibben, who is also here with him tonight. We have the term rubblization has come up numerous times at our meetings, and through various avenues, I ended up talking to Mike and Doug, and they agreed to come up here and explain it all to us. So I'm sure by the time we leave, we'll all know what it means, what it is. So I really want to thank you for coming. And I'm assuming in your presentation, you're going to tell us a little bit about yourself. So welcome.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you for having me tonight. Yes, my name's Doug Larson, and I'm with Geosyntec Consultants. I'm a civil engineer there. And I will be talking to you tonight about rubblization and recycling of concrete. This is probably the audience that cares the most about this subject. If I brought this up with my wife, she might not fully appreciate the topic, but I appreciate you having me here. So just a little bit by way of background, I studied civil engineering at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh as an undergrad in the early 1980s. And while I was there, worked with a group of researchers to design and build a robot to decontaminate the basement of the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor. So that was my first experience with a radiologically impacted site. Then I moved from there, came to New England for graduate school, pursued a PhD at MIT in geotechnical engineering, which I finished in 1992. And I've been working since that time in the site investigation and cleanup of hazardous waste sites and sites impacted by radionuclides. I've also done some teaching. I taught a graduate course in soil mechanics for a couple of years at UMass Lowell and also at Tufts University, and then I do some courses on hazardous waste site cleanup a few times a year at different places around the country. So that's me. And because nobody's done a safety moment yet, because our company, like many others in our industry, practices a behavior-based safety culture, it's our custom to start a meeting that has more than 2 people in it with a safety moment. So I thought, with it being fall and winter, unfortunately, depending on how you feel about it, just around the corner, that winterizing your vehicle would be a good place to start for tonight. Tips for winter driving: first, be on top of the weather so that you know if a storm is coming. If you can avoid the storm, do so. And if you can't, then be sure your car is ready. So that's point number 2 there. Make sure the tires are in good shape, and then pack the necessary equipment for dealing with snow, like maybe a shovel, tire chains if you have them, those kinds of things. And lastly, some essential supplies so that if you do get stuck, you'll be okay. Warm blanket or warm clothing, and some food bars or something like that in the car. All right, thank you. And so with that, I'll move on to the main part of the presentation. I'll give you a brief introduction, very brief, I promise, to the company that I work for, just for some context. And then I'll discuss the concept of recycling concrete, or taking rubble and turning it into recycled concrete aggregate. Talk about some of the challenges and the benefits associated with this process, and then talk as best I can with limited knowledge about future site-specific engineering considerations, and particularly geotechnical considerations, because I know that Chris Campany, I think at your June meeting, had brought up the question, if you were to backfill structures at Vermont Yankee with rubbleized fill, would you be able to then put light or heavy industrial buildings on top of that? So I will get to that. Our company was founded in 1983 with a focus on helping the United States manage its solid waste challenges. So in those early days, we were doing things like writing guidance documents and regulatory guidelines for the design of landfills, for doing landfill liners and covers and things like that. And then as the company grew, we developed recognized expertise in other areas, like the cleanup of hazardous and radiologically impacted sites, water and natural resources management, geotechnical engineering, and the other disciplines that I've listed up there. Also, because of our, I've listed up here some of the types of clients we work for. We work for both public and private sector clients. And because of our roots in waste management facilities, we've done quite a few projects for the DOE, designing and overseeing the construction of some of their containment facilities. And then also some other facilities that I've listed here. So like the Waste Control Specialist site in Texas, there we have done construction oversight and certified the design on behalf of the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality. The significance of that site is that this is one of only 4 in the country where you can send this type of waste, and this cell, which is part of that facility, is where the waste from Vermont Yankee, the low-level waste, would be slated to go. So that was just a bit of a coincidence, but thought worth putting up on the slide. So now to get into the topic of rubblization, the gist of it, as I'm sure you all are familiar with at this point, is you're taking a concrete structure, whether that be a building or a road, something made out of concrete, and you're going to break that concrete down to a point where you have some kind of usable product, and I'll go through that process in subsequent slides. With respect to a nuclear power plant, a key factor in this is evaluating what the radiological activity of the concrete is. And so if you have concrete that's above a threshold, that would be segregated from material that's below the threshold. The material below the threshold could be crushed up and reused. The material that's above the threshold then goes off-site as a waste product. As far as those thresholds go, the second bullet here gives that 25 millirem standard. It sounds like you're considering, or NorthStar's considering, an alternate exposure limit, but that was just an example from NRC that I thought I would put up there. That's old news at this point. Okay, so rubblization, when you go through that process of breaking down the concrete, putting it through a crusher or some other way of reducing the particle size, results in this recycled concrete aggregate, or RCA. And so that's the term I'll use more throughout the rest of the talk, because as an engineer, I like the fact it's kind of an engineered material with regular properties that I can predict. So RCA use is quite common, and I'll show you some example uses for RCA on the next slide. And it has approval through federal and state departments of transportation, particularly for use as a sub-base for roadways. So let me jump ahead because that last bullet we've already talked about. So why do people want to recycle concrete in this way? There's really 2 key advantages, and I think that when Scott was speaking earlier, he touched on at least one of these. So one is it reduces the use of virgin materials from off-site. So if you're not going to backfill with the material that came from the site, you have to bring that material from somewhere else, which means you need to mine it out of that resource, whether it's a quarry or borrow pit or whatever it is, and bring it in. And that involves typically trucking it in, which involves a lot of truckloads. You also, the other benefit is that you're reducing unnecessary landfilling of this material. And so with construction and demolition debris landfills filling up, if you can save the space in those landfills for less benign material, then you've extended the life of that landfill. And Vermont encourages the use of recycling for exactly that purpose, to avoid overloading landfills. Okay. So some uses for this recycled concrete aggregate include general backfill, like we're talking about for backfilling a building that you take down. Erosion control measures like riprap. The Army Corps uses recycled concrete aggregate for riprap along waterways. Also granular fill applications. I mentioned the sub-base for roadways, landscaping, pipe bedding, those sorts of things. Okay, so here's a very simplified process flow diagram to show how this works. The one step in this process that I didn't show is off to the left here, before you start demolishing things, would be a pre-characterization step. So, and also a preparation step where you would do things like remove metal brackets and shelving and whatnot. And then characterize the surfaces of the concrete if there's coatings or other things that may impact the process. You might take some cores to understand the strength of the concrete, or I'll talk about leachability of the concrete. Not typically an issue, but that's something that you can test for up front to see if that is a potential concern down the road. And then once you've done that and you've got your work plans in place, then you can begin your demolition probably not with a wrecking ball, but that was the best graphic I could find to show that. And as your buildings start to come down, then you are going to have a debris pile of the pieces of concrete that have come out of that structure. And the important step here, if you're dealing with a site like Vermont Yankee, is the segregation, where you're going to manage materials that are above your acceptance criteria differently than the material that's below the acceptance criteria, and keeping those two streams separate. The clean concrete debris, the material that's below that acceptance criteria, you then rubblize. And so that I've got an excavator here with an air hammer. That's a typical way that you could rubblize the concrete. So you're basically taking the large pieces, breaking it down to the point where you have the concrete rubble. The steel can be removed from it as you break the concrete down. You break it down to a size that you could then feed into a crusher or some other piece of equipment that will result in this recycled concrete aggregate product that you can then use for engineering applications. And so here's a picture of this process at work. This is from a site that we're working on in New Jersey. It was a fertilizer manufacturing facility. At this site, we're crushing about 360,000 cubic yards. So just for scale, if I understand the thoughts for Vermont Yankee, that's about 40,000 cubic yards. So this one is not quite 10 times that size. And the idea here is, because it was a fertilizer manufacturing plant, there's some naturally occurring radioactive materials in fertilizer. So this also had to be checked radiologically before it could be crushed. So the suitable material at below the acceptance criteria is then loaded by an excavator here and transferred into the crusher. From the crusher, it goes onto this conveyor, and the conveyor then sends the RCA, the recycled concrete aggregate, onto the stockpile, where it can then be taken for whatever reuse purposes. In this case, it was to backfill building voids. So I mentioned material management here. That there's two implications there. One is controlling the material properties, so sizing that crushed material so it has the properties that you want. That's particularly true for subbase for roads, where you need a particular size and gradation for that application. Also segregating clean versus impacted material, as I mentioned before, and then staging the process material for subsequent reuse are all steps in that material management. I'll talk a little bit more about some environmental considerations towards the end of the talk, but just listing them here. Noise and air impacts while you're doing the rubblization, and then the longer term things that you want to consider are management of potential long-term impacts to stormwater and groundwater, and I'll talk about how we do that in a little bit. So some, I'll call them challenges with reuse. One is stormwater runoff control. So you're going to have these stockpiles of recycled concrete aggregate waiting to be reused. If it starts to rain, you run the risk of fines from these piles being carried off by rainwater, getting into surface water bodies, and so you need to establish adequate protections to stop that from happening, so you don't have excessive suspended solids getting into your waterways. This is part of standard construction practices, setting up sedimentation and erosion controls. They're typically silt fence, but you can use other things as well. This portion of the slide shows somebody doing a surface scan. So this is looking for material that would potentially meet acceptance criteria versus not. So he's characterizing before the building comes down. I mentioned here management of change in material properties. The reason I put that up there, if you are getting concrete from a variety of sources and the material properties may be variable, that's something you need to account for in the design of the reuse of that. So again, for if you're using the material for a roadway subbase, you'd want to account for the variability in material properties. For something like demolition of a plant where all the concrete was poured, I would expect at roughly the same time with a similar quality, that's probably not going to be too much of a consideration. On the environmental side and geotechnical, I'll touch on those towards the end, but there are some design considerations you need to take into account with this on both of those fronts, in addition to the stormwater runoff control. And then lastly, I mentioned here worker safety considerations, and the reason I bring that up is with any large construction project, you have physical hazards to your workers, and so you'll prepare a health and safety plan, you'll have training ahead of time, and then while the project is ongoing, you'd have a site safety officer making sure that the safety protocols are being followed that are set out in that health and safety plan. Some benefits of reuse, I touched before about a couple of these, but I really want to emphasize that the reduced truck traffic for both the export and import of fill is, in my mind, a significant advantage to keeping the material on site, because with every truckload that's going to be on the order of 15 to 20 tons, each truck trip has the potential to result in an accident. It's a finite chance, but it's there. And so keeping everything on site helps you control some of those risks in a more contained way. And then on the sustainability front, recycling the materials helps prevent material that doesn't need to go to a landfill necessarily from going to a landfill. And as a result of the reduced number of truck trips, you also reduce the carbon footprint of the project. So with respect to geotechnical considerations, I had mentioned that on an earlier slide, and I think this, Chris, gets at the concern or the question that you raised. So with backfilling large construction voids, you'd crush the material down to some maximum size. I've seen 10 inches, 6 inches, 4 inches, but it doesn't, going smaller doesn't matter. You just need to get it to a size that's manageable. And then you would place that recycled concrete aggregate that's been crushed up into the void space left by inside the building foundations. Now what happens is when you place this and it settles in, this recycled concrete aggregate is angular, like a good crushed stone or something like that. It's also very hard if it's a good quality concrete. And so these particles will fit together and start to interlock, and they form what I'll call an aggregate skeleton. What I mean by that, each contact point transmits stress through it, through this whole structure of the recycled concrete aggregate. So if I put a load on the surface of that of this backfilled matrix here, and I put a load on the surface of it, that load gets transmitted through all those contact points through this skeleton, if you will. It gets transmitted both vertically and then also laterally. An advantage to the lateral stresses pushing out is that when you've taken everything out of the building, you still have soil pressure on the outside of the foundation walls pushing in. So adding this aggregate to the inside helps stabilize that. It basically imposes an outward force pushing on the walls. And then you have, because the building was designed to carry heavy loads, in this case the nuclear reactor, if you put other loads on top of that, it's going to be less than the load imposed by the nuclear reactor. So I wouldn't expect the foundation elements that are already there to settle certainly any more than they had already settled under the load of the plant. So I hope that's a helpful answer to you. We can certainly talk more about it afterwards. And so let's see, I think that touches on everything on that slide. On the environmental side, I mentioned noise and air impacts that you need to control while you're doing the rubblization process. The noise impacts are similar to any other heavy construction project, and you can set noise thresholds as part of your planning process, so you'd have somebody with a decibel meter monitoring compliance with that, and if you need to mitigate noise, you can do so, or do things like limit working hours, or whatever's needed. I mentioned with respect to air, it's the generation of dust that you're concerned about, and however, that can be mitigated with dust suppression equipment. Usually it's a water spray. So at the point of the most dust generation, which is in the crusher, those usually have a dust suppression system incorporated right into them to to keep the dust down there. The other place where you get dust is in the stockpile management, and so you can put a water spray on that, and there was a picture in an earlier slide of that water spray on a stockpile. With respect to longer-term impacts, I mentioned leachability here. So sometimes if you have a low-grade concrete, something that has a lot of fly ash in it or something like that, you can get metals within the concrete that could leach out over time. I've only seen that happen a couple of times, and like I mentioned, with a low-grade concrete, but that's certainly something that you would want to test ahead of time. So as part of your planning process, you'd have a work plan that would, or a pre-characterization plan, where you take some cores and you can test the material to see if leaching of metals or other contaminants is going to be an issue, and then material that doesn't meet threshold values for those would also be managed as a waste, and material that meets your acceptance criteria on that front could be crushed and reused. The same holds true for groundwater interaction, in that if you have already checked that leaching is not going to be an issue with your concrete, it shouldn't impact the groundwater either. Okay, so just to wrap up, the recycled concrete aggregate is it's a pretty widely used construction material, particularly for road subbases and backfill. It's recognized, and in fact there's specifications for it through the federal agencies and numerous state agencies, including Vermont. The concrete that's characterized as clean through your pre-characterization process can be used as an environmentally safe fill, so you can satisfy yourself that leaching won't be an issue down the road. And then reuse of that demolition debris has some benefits to it, like reducing the safety risks, conserving the resources from the borrow pits and such, and also the reduced carbon footprint. So those are the benefits, if you will, in a nutshell. And with that, that wraps up the speaking part of the presentation.
Thank you. I have to tell you, Doug, you did it in exactly 20 minutes, which is the time we gave you. So I don't know if you practiced or what, but that was great.
Maybe a little.
Yeah, does anyone have any comments? And I'm going to get to the public. We're going to do panel questions first, and then we'll do public questions. Yes.
I'll just return this to the podium while the first question happens.
So I really appreciate that. That's great. I gather, Scott, you may, you still here? So I gather, like in this application, like where you're going to have pipes remaining or cut pipes, structure remaining 4 feet below grade, you're going to have some kind of crush run something in order to bear a load potentially in the future, right? Whether it's rubblized concrete or crush run gravel or stone or something, you're going to want some kind of angular something to provide that structural property, I would guess.
You mean over the top?
And Doug,
Yeah.
Doug, we're getting you a mic, Doug.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I intended to mention that when I talked about the geotechnical consideration, so I am glad you brought that up. So yes, at the surface, you're going to have some surface voids that you need to bridge. And there's a couple ways you can do that. So right, you can do kind of a reverse graded fill where you coarse grading up to finer, and then you can put a vegetative layer or foundation elements or whatever you want above that. You can also use a combination of geotextile elements, so a geotextile to keep the fines above, combined with a geogrid to give it strength over the voids, and those are very long lasting.
So can I ask, so profile, like if you're backfilling a pipe, you might have the coarser fines down at the coarser material at the bottom, like you're saying less than 10 inches, but still, I mean, so the coarser material would go there if you were to do a section of it, and then it would get gradually smaller as you go up in order to support a load on top of that at some point. Is that the way it would work?
It's not so much the load that you're worried about supporting, it's the fact that if you have the larger pieces, the void spaces between them scale based on the size. So you need to put some smaller aggregate in there that'll bridge those voids without falling through them. And then you can put something finer above that that will bridge those voids without falling in, and progressively on up. So that's a way that you can bridge the gap. So you just terminate your the larger aggregate deep enough so that you can achieve the gradation that you need.
So generally speaking, like in New England, where you would have some structures 4 feet below grade, backfilling void, whether it's rubblized concrete or stone or whatever it is, does that create any challenges for future construction on the site of different types of structures?
You mean if you wanted to dig through it?
Now, if you want, well, yeah, if you want, like, if you were to reuse the site for industrial, light industrial, whatever you're going to build, in Vermont's climate with, and I don't know if you know the soils on the site, but just in general, if you have foundations and other things 4 feet below grade, and then any voids are backfilled, whether it's with rubblized concrete or stone or whatever, what, from a site engineering perspective, you want to go back and redevelop something on that site. But in this case, I'm talking a building, not a solar array or something with a standing pole, but some kind of structure. Just from a site engineering perspective or geoscience engineering perspective, what would that mean for building buildings on that site again?
Well, you would. It really depends on what the foundation design for that building looked like. So if you needed footer elements that went below 4 feet or below the top of your below the top of the rubble, then what I would expect you would need to do is remove that surface layer that you put on there, at least in the zones where you need to put the footers down. Remove the crushed aggregate to a depth that allows you to put that footing there. And then, again, you could bridge the top of that with geotextile elements, or you could go deep enough that you could bridge it with graded fill, like we were describing before. And I have dug through concrete rubble, actually large chunks, when we've remediated sites where the concrete rubble went on top of other stuff we need to get at. You can do it. It does take a little bit more work than digging through native soil, but it's certainly doable with an excavator.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Derek and then Chuck.
Yeah, I have a concern. Once you bury the radioactive concrete, my concern is how do you prevent it from spreading, traveling through the soil if there's water? I mean, these pits are not lined, and there's a river right nearby. I would hate to think that some of this radioactive material would travel to the river.
Yeah, you wouldn't bury radioactive material. So the first step in the process for a facility like this would be to segregate the material that doesn't meet the, in this case, the unrestricted use criteria. So you wouldn't be putting contaminated concrete back into the foundations. It would be the inert concrete.
Are you saying that it's completely clean, or it's down to a standard of 15 milligram?
Well, you'd set that criterion up front in the project. From what I heard in the previous presentation, the proposal there, or the standard being considered, was 15 milligram.
So Derek's question was a great segue to mine, and I represent the Agency of Natural Resources, and we're more concerned with the non-radiological contamination. So I appreciate your description of the sampling of the concrete to ensure it's clean. I was wondering if you could share your experience. You showed the New Jersey example of what you said, 4 times as much. What kind of sampling really did you do? I mean, that's an awful lot of concrete. Are you talking one sample every 500 square feet, or is it pretty exhaustive so we can assure that the concrete's clean? And do you also do an occasional sample of what's already been crushed to make sure you're not missing any contamination that could then lead to migration to groundwater and impact the river?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question, because that was another point that I had hoped to make but overlooked. So with respect to your first question, I don't know what the frequency of pre-characterization sampling was, but I could find out for you. and maybe report back to you, Kate, on that. The person who's running that program is on vacation. He would have been here tonight, but he's on vacation with his wife for 2 weeks, so I can get you an answer to that. With respect to your other question, actually, if you could repeat the second half of that so I get it right, that would be helpful.
Well, I think my main point is to make sure we want to feel comfortable that if they are rubbleizing and it's allowed in any agreement, that the material is truly clean.
Yes.
So I guess from your experience, you know, what do you recommend for amount of sampling, and what are you looking for? One of our big concerns at this site from non-radiological is that it hasn't been adequately characterized. We really don't know what chemicals have been used on the site fully. We have some ideas, but not fully characterized, and it's been an industrial site for a long time.
Yeah.
So if you were presented with this situation, you know, what would your recommendations be to ensure that the concrete you're rubbleizing is indeed clean?
So the part of the answer is it depends, but the quality control procedures you would certainly do, or I would recommend doing some post-processing sampling along the way for exactly the reasons that you're describing. It's a check on what you assume to be true at the start of the project. That is often statistically based, so I'd look at the results that you're getting from your pre-sample characterization. You'll have some variability, most likely, in those data, and that degree of variability will help inform what you'd want to look for in your post-processing. So without that information, I can't be much more specific than that. I mean, if you look at, say, landfill acceptance criteria, those also vary from like 1 every 500 yards, or that you'd have to decide on that statistically. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. First question: are you or is your company working with Entergy or NorthStar in any projects? This one to start with, and then any other across the country?
No, we don't work with either of them on this project. We have worked on projects in other parts of the country where NorthStar has been a contractor. So one that I'm familiar with is a site in Ohio where we did project management and planning. I think NorthStar was the demolition contractor there. So, I mean, they're one of the larger demolition contractors, so probably most civil engineering firms have run across them at one point or another.
Right, and I wanted to ask your knowledge, this issue of leachability.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that at Maine Yankee there was an issue of contamination of the environment from the concrete itself because of the constituents in the concrete actually leading to excessive quantities. I'm not sure if it was a particular or peculiar kind of concrete. Are you familiar with that particular issue at Maine Yankee?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Have you heard of concrete that's been rubbleized and left on site leading to any kind of non-radiological contamination issues that had to be managed afterwards?
No, I'm not familiar with that. I did work at a site where concrete was used to create a slurry wall foundation, and they had mixed quite a bit of fly ash in with the concrete, I think to accelerate the curing of it. And that one we had, for a period of time, some high levels of iron and manganese that over time flushed out. That's off the top of my head the only example I can think of where there was where I saw contamination in groundwater associated with the concrete.
And then almost all of this concrete at this site has extensive reinforcement steel in it, rebar.
Yes.
I'm sorry if I missed it. How do you remove that in the rubblization process?
So as you're breaking the concrete into smaller and smaller chunks, you expose that rebar and are able to pull it out. If the rebar is very tightly spaced, you're probably going to end up with particle sizes smaller than 10 inches, for example, if the rebar was inches apart.
Right. And you're bringing up manganese. I think that could be related to reinforced steel that might be used as rebar, and manganese is sometimes a problem with regard to environmental monitoring and drinking water. So that may have been one of the issues that I've read elsewhere. I was also interested in the surveillance of the material afterwards, after you do your rubblization. You do that radiologically and non-radiologically. Do you have a sense of what kind of rigor goes into the radiological surveillance of rubbleized concrete aggregate before it is dispensed into the fill area?
Well, that you establish that as part of your work planning process, so I don't have a specific recommendation, say, for a facility like this. So that you'd have some stakeholder input on what people would want to see for a sampling frequency and factor that into the plan.
Right. And your, I wanted to ask your opinion, is concrete that's been scabbled, which is a technique that's used frequently in decommissioning radiologically contaminated facilities, and it's described for this facility too, is the material that's left over after scabbling, which is chosen to be scabbled off because it is radiologically contaminated, is the material that's left over, is that designated as decontaminated material because you've scabbled the contamination off, or is it not contaminated because you didn't have to remove contamination from what's left over?
If you had material at the surface that was contaminated and you broke it off, then that would go, in my opinion, that would go off as a waste stream.
Right. But what remained would not necessarily be waste stream, but it would be a candidate for rubblization, and in your opinion, that would be non-contaminated?
That's something you'd have to define up front. I mean, if in fact you had removed sufficient contamination from the surface that what remained was not radiologically or chemically above standards, I suppose it would be, but you know, I can't opine whether that would be an appropriate thing to do or not with respect to Vermont Yankee.
And I'm almost done. If I could ask just two more real quick
ones.
Did you do an analysis that actually, on page 9 of your presentation, you say it's lower emissions, noise, and dust, comparing the noise, dust, and emissions relative to trucking it off versus actually using these machines and other kinds of techniques to get it into this rubblized concrete aggregate? Do you do an analysis to actually verify that there is less dust, less noise, and less emissions?
It's not so much less dust and noise as it is lower carbon footprint. So I did have somebody in our office analyze that, doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation for rubbleizing on site versus trucking in fill, and it was on the order of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide, I believe, different. But I don't have the analysis with me.
And then the last one is, you mentioned that you could, if it were noise, and at the health department as well as other departments here in the state, we get a lot of noise questions. You mentioned that they might limit working hours. I don't know if you can answer this or others could, but are there limits on working hours during the decon that's taking place for the decommissioning of the Vermont Yankee site? Or are they planning in their efforts to work primarily or principally every day, every hour until this is done? Are there limits on their work times?
I don't know.
Is there anyone here that can answer that question?
I can speak kind of round robin to that. If you are familiar with the plant site, and of course across the street from the plant is the school, next to the school is the town hall. If you're there during the daytime, you look across from town hall, there's a very large field there that has a mountain of crushed stone And that's the crushed stone that's picked up by the railroad and is put onto the rail beds around this area. And this isn't unique to Vernon. Vernon has a rock crusher that you can hear during the daytime at Vermont Yankee. And it crushes stone on a near continuous basis. My understanding is there are permits for it, and there are hours of the day that it can run. And I believe it's 7 in the morning to 6 at night or something like that. And after that, it cannot run. So there are standards.
I want to do one more panel question. I think Laura has a question.
So in listening to the benefits to doing this, most of what I'm hearing are cost benefits, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In terms of the environmental, and I presume that the cost benefits kind of roll up towards a faster decommissioning.
I suppose it could. I haven't analyzed that.
Okay. In terms of the environmental benefits, what I'm hearing, it seems like those are simply from kind of containing the material on the site.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any environmental improvement to the site through this process?
As opposed to bringing, the difference would be bringing fill from off-site in and using that. Whether that's a break even or there's a benefit to the recycled aggregate, I don't know whether there's truly a net benefit there or not.
Okay, and then my last question, Kate, is just in this process, is there an advantage to the long-term reuse of the site by employing this process?
Well, one advantage you have is that once you've created this aggregate fill, it will be very stable, so it shouldn't be prone to settling. If you backfilled with off-site fill, you can also compact that in lifts, and so that it is not prone to settling, but it takes a fair amount of effort to do that. So, I would think with the concrete fill, because it is a very hard material, that it would be less prone to settling over time than off-site fill that you brought in.
So I heard you say you would think that. I mean, is that the case with? I'm not a construction person, or kind of.
I would expect so. I would expect less settling with the coarser aggregate than I would with a finer grained soil that I brought off from a borrow pit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
It's going to be a quick one.
Thanks, Kate. Real quick question. Actually, it's for A&R. It says here that for in this presentation, the non-radiological cleanup criteria would be with complying with the industrial standards in the April 2012 rule. But a new rule, it was readopted or changed this year, isn't it? Wouldn't they be required to go with the current rule at the time they're doing it?
Yeah, it's our opinion, absolutely. And what they referenced was actually a procedure that we've introduced as a rule, and a rule has a lot more weight and authority to enforce. So we absolutely think they need to look at the standards in the rule, which was adopted this summer.
So going forward with the Public Utilities Commission, that would be the state's position on that?
That is our position, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to move to public questions, but what I would love is if a show of hands on how many people have a question. All right, what I would ask is that you ask one question and make it as short as possible so that we can make sure we have the time to answer it. And again, if you could tell us who you are and where you are from.
Hi, my name is Clay Turnbull. I am a staff person and trustee with New England Coalition. And I give you the award for the most dynamic presentation. I mean, we see a lot of presentations, and that truly was a pleasure to be a part of.
Thank you.
Has your company decommissioned any nuclear power plants?
Not to my knowledge. We have, though, taken built containment systems for radiological waste at a variety of sites, both here and overseas.
Are you aware of any nuclear power stations that have rubbleized and then sent that rubble to be used for general backfill, construction, structural fill, roadways, landscaping? Do you think that having rubble from a nuclear power station would be, is there a big market for, you think, for rubbleized concrete from a nuclear power plant?
I don't know. You know, I could ask somebody at the Army Corps if they've put that in their riprap, but I don't know.
Okay. I just want to be very, very clear that Entergy has made a commitment not to rubbleize. And there's a list of reasons why that is the case, and this isn't the forum to go over all of those. But it's a very, very clear record, not only in the past docket, but going back dockets before that, where Entergy's site vice president, Jay Thayer, under cross-examination, said very clearly, rubbleization will not be utilized. So it's perhaps at an upcoming ENDICAT meeting, you would want to hear from Ray Shaddis, who could tell you about the main experience from from firsthand experience being there. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Clay. Someone else want to? Yeah, please come up. If you could keep it to like a minute or question, that'd be great.
Just one question. Thank you. Again, Skylar Gould from New England Coalition. What are the, you've talked a little bit about leachability into groundwater. There must be a vast record. What are the long-term implications of it, what sounds like not that much compared to some projects? You know, what's going to be there 100 years from now or 200 years from now with rainwater flushing through this rubbleized concrete? What are the long-term implications?
I would expect there, once you've run the leaching tests up front, I wouldn't expect there to be any. The concrete is inert. It will behave like a stone backfill.
You're sure of that? So concrete does decay over time. I'm just, depends on the concrete, of course. This would be very dense.
Yes.
Solid concrete. So are there reference materials that could reference what the long-term implications are of leachate into the water table?
Well, the reason I mentioned the concrete being inert in the hazardous waste site cleanup business that I'm involved in, one of the remedies that we use if there are metals in soil that we're concerned about migrating, a common practice is to encapsulate them in concrete so that they won't leach. And so that's really the basis for my response there, is that if you have a good quality concrete and you run the synthetic leaching tests and you do demonstrate that in fact it is inert chemically, then I wouldn't expect that to change over time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have one more question, yeah, or two more. If you make it quicker, we'll get more people in. Thank you.
Peter Vanderos from West Brattleboro. First of all, I'd like to thank the gentleman from Geosyntec for mentioning water spray to keep the dust down. And that's very concerning when the reactor building will be taken down. And I wonder, I don't see Scott State in the audience. This is more to NorthStar. Will they be using continuous water spray to avoid the spread of radioactive dust when they take down the reactor building? Does anybody know?
No, but we can pose that question to them.
All right, thanks so much.
Coward, I think you were it.
Thank you for calling me. Howard Schaefer, Enfield, New Hampshire, nuclear engineer, retired, was a startup engineer at Vermont Yankee. I'm going to address the cleanup standards briefly, but I want to divert a minute. After that, I spent some time working for Yankee Atomic Electric Company, Nuclear Services Division, in support of Vermont Yankee and Seabrook and others. And in that capacity as a system engineer, wrestling with the NRC over licensing issues, and one of the big problems with terminology, as we see here, over unrestricted use. And I don't think the NRC would object if, when we talked about it, we just inserted the word radiologically unrestricted in front of the term when we used it. So I'd like to recommend that to NorthStar and the others, and I think it would make it clear to the general public what we were talking about. The NRC only talks about things within their purview, so they don't think it's necessary to say it's radiological. As far as the standards go, I wanted to give a little background, but I wanted to talk about the elephant in the room quickly.
Now, Howard, do you have any questions for Doug now? That's what we're doing right now.
Oh, just for Doug?
Yeah. We're going to go to the general comments after we get, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't want him to have to sit here for an eternity, but you can go up first on the comment period. I want to thank you, Doug, for coming this evening. I think based on the questions, it was very, very helpful. Good. And I want to thank Mike. He helped coordinate this whole thing. So thank you. And I'll tell my story about going to Plymouth last night, but I said, Doug, that you could go down and help the people in Plymouth next stop. So
yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to be here tonight.
Thank you so much. Next on the agenda is the conversation about the documents that Entergy and NorthStar have asked to put, I'm not going to say secret because that sounds bad, but the protective order on the additional documents. And this was a conversation that we began in June with Representative Dean. And since then, they've asked for additional documents to be included. So I'm not sure. I know Steph had mentioned she might want to mention something to talk about this and tell us what's going on, and then we can see if we have any more questions. So thank you.
Thank you. So I believe Commissioner Tierney discussed a little bit of the process in June, but just to recap that, there is a standard protocol per the Vermont Rules of Civil Procedure that is adopted by the board for dealing with confidential materials in front of the commission, and there are different phases at which those materials are addressed in litigation. And so when a party is before the Public Utility Commission and believes that they have documents that they need to produce during the discovery process in the beginning of the proceedings in response to questions that they've received, there is a standard protective agreement that they can file. They can file with the Public Utility Commission asking to protect those documents as an initial matter. And what the Public Utility Commission did in this case is they issued that order allowing that protection to go forward, but indicated, as they customarily do, that at other junctures in the proceeding, the parties that are asking for those protections, i.e. the joint petitioners, will need to be more specific about their claim regarding specific documents that would be used in litigation. So just to back up for the non-lawyers out there so I can try to speak a bit more English, initially the proceeding is very broad, and we as the department, as I indicated long ago when you first met me, we asked over 1,000 questions of the joint petitioners in this case. So in response to those 1,000 questions, they have multiple thousands of documents that respond to them. A good chunk of those documents, the petitioners want to cast a wide net and say, these are proprietary, or these have important security information in them, etc. This is a practice that not just Entergy and NorthStar engage in, but utilities in the state of Vermont have to be concerned about, other developers and private companies. So that this protocol, this protective agreement, is in place to deal with this issue so that we can get that information quickly, efficiently, and analyze it as the regulator. Then the proceeding starts to narrow. So when we come to the juncture that we just went through, the testimony portion of the proceeding, there's another inquiry. Basically, when the department, A&R, other parties file testimony, we rely on certain documents to make the conclusions in that testimony. Some of those documents, which have now been whittled from the many thousands to actually just a few dozen critical documents, forces the petitioners to then file specific reasons with the commission as to why those small subset of documents should still be treated as confidential, and they need to make assertions about those documents to the commission and get an affirmative decision from the commission that they should remain confidential in the proceeding. In order to address that, the different parties have agreed to redact the testimony that references those documents, and that's what I was talking about earlier, that the department's main staff witness's testimony has no such redactions, but some of the experts that that testimony relies on have made preliminary redactions waiting for the Public Utility Commission to issue a decision in this matter. If the Public Utility Commission reviews joint petitioner's request and says no, these documents are not to remain confidential in this proceeding, then they would become public, and so would all the testimony referencing them. And you can imagine that certain documents would remain confidential and certain would not, and the accompanying testimony would then therefore be unredacted or left redacted. Further, as we get to the evidentiary hearing point in the process, this inquiry occurs again as to whether those documents will be public or remain confidential under the protocol. As many of you are aware, there were two specific documents during the same time that this standard protocol was being requested by the joint petitioners, two documents, a deal model and a disbursement schedule, that NorthStar identified as highly confidential. This is also a somewhat standard designation, and I'll use that term in a different way here, meaning other parties before the Public Utility Commission have made such requests about particular documents that they say, this is our secret sauce. This information is so critical to our business model, for example, that if it were leaked or if it were made public, we would cease to be able to operate it as a business, or we'd lose a significant advantage that we have in the marketplace. When they highlighted those two documents, the Public Utility Commission issued a separate order in June indicating that they reviewed them, and they reviewed them in private, and said that deal model will fall under the standard protective agreement. It's not super secret sauce, but the disbursement schedule we deem, at least preliminarily, to fall under a different protocol. The department argued during that time, because the petitioners had proposed something different, that all parties who had signed the standard protective agreement should have access to that highly confidential disbursement schedule, meaning you can't pick and choose. You can't let the department see it, but not another party who signed on to the agreement and agreed to the protocols. And that's what the commission ended up deciding. So for the time being, that schedule is available to all the parties that signed the standard agreement, but there are some extra safety protocols that are being implemented to try to protect that information. Until the PUC decides the joint petitioner's current request regarding the actual documents and how they're being utilized in the testimony, I can't opine as to what their decision would be, but the joint petitioners have made that proposal to the commission, and we are awaiting a decision about the final version of the testimony, as it will be redacted or unredacted, and to what extent.
Now, Steph, do you know, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you know what the timing of this may be?
I wish I had a crystal ball, Kate. There are critical decisions in this litigation that are influenced by whether or not those documents remain confidential and the testimony accompanying them. I will highlight an example, which is, as we go into depositions, there are questions that become much more complicated given the fact that certain parties, for example, aren't signatories to the agreement, but may have questions for the petitioners about other things. So these are the types of issues that get compounded as we move forward. I anticipate, but I can't promise, that they would make a decision potentially before the rebuttal testimony is due, which is October 17th, just because this issue needs to be resolved so that it doesn't carry forward through the remainder of the proceeding in the way that it would if they didn't make the decision.
Chris. Oh, David, yes.
Part of my concern keeping this on the agenda was that in this process, what has been asked to be protected really is sort of a linchpin of making the decision on the part of our Public Utilities Commission, and linchpin for what the department is saying and what other stakeholders and parties are saying. As I understand what you've just said, the preliminary decision is that anybody who has signed that protective agreement, and I read that, I guess, back last spring, that, okay, they can have the information, they can, in fact, make internal decisions about it, but they cannot make it public. Is that an accurate summary of where we are right now with this one remaining document being requested to be at some other higher level of protection? In other words, do the stakeholders, do the interested parties have access to that information, and can they evaluate it?
So I probably have 3 responses to your question. The first is all parties to the docket have the right to sign the protective agreement. The separate protocol for the highly confidential document doesn't change the ability to review or internalize the information received from that document by any of those parties. It just tells the parties you have to take these additional steps to protect it, which are logistical. They're not about looking at the documents and reviewing it. That being said, I want to stress what has happened in this litigation, which is, again, the documents, the field of documents we're talking about that have remained confidential has gone from thousands to dozens in terms of what's actually at the core of what the agencies have identified as critically important to analyzing this transaction.
Information you need to analyze the transaction.
Yes, and we have that information. However, 2 things have happened as a result of that, which is my second point. One is the testimony that we provided, we worked very hard to assure that a minimal amount of that testimony, as minimal as possible, continued to be public so that our rationales for assessing this transaction could be viewed by all parties and the entire public. NorthStar and Entergy we asked them to review our testimony and unredact as many portions as had been preliminarily redacted before the PUC made a decision. That has also happened and portions became more public. And the third point I will make is reading the testimony of both Mr. Wynn, the other department experts, and then also the experts offered by ANR and other parties. At this juncture, there's no doubt in my mind that the rationales behind our assessment and the identifications of the risks and financial uncertainties at this point will be abundantly clear, regardless of these few confidential documents that still need to be assessed by the PUC, and that the entire logic of that assessment is transparent.
Good. I feel better. Thank you.
Chris, did you have a question?
Just a comment. That the clarity of that of all of that at 8:45 p.m. after a full workday, it's recorded there. You should keep this snippet because this is going to come up, I'm sure, in some other docket or something. But you did a great job.
Thanks, Chris.
Wow. Yeah, thank you, staff. Does anyone else have any questions? No. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, I'm afraid of my own voice if you saw me jumping.
There was some speculation over here that there's a ghost in this room.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Now, Howard, it's time. We're going to have time for public comment, and I would ask if you have a comment, come to the microphone, give us your name and where you're from, and if you can keep it in 1 or 2 minutes, we'd really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me jumping the gun before, but I did want to get this in. For the site standards, as we all know, there's a difference in belief on radiation safety, whether any amount is dangerous or whether any amount is not dangerous. A lot is dangerous, some is beneficial and even helpful, giving you a vaccination effect. And there's differences on the whether this is proved by the scientific research or not. But since the standards that generated the term any amount is dangerous were generated and still exist in the regulations, there's been 50 years of research and data from around the world. Significantly, all those in the community know of the city of Ramsar, Iran, where their normal background is the highest there is in the world. And it is 260,000 millirem per year, which is 1,000 times more than we're talking about the allowed standard for background on the site, from the site itself. So that research over 50, 60 years has proven that we evolved in a radiation environment and our bodies are very resilient and resistant to normal things, just as they are to various disease mechanisms. Of course there's too much, but that's the context. Something that's 1,000 times more than what we're using for a standard, and there's no detectable effects on the people there. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I think it's Bob Spencer's turn.
Bob Spencer, Chairman of the Vernon Planning and Economic Development Commission. I just want to say, first of all, thanks. It's been an excellent program with new content, and I think we've all learned something tonight. So I also learned quite a bit today on the tour I went on with quite a few of the Public Service Board staff and various people today at the site, really talking specifically about the decommissioning process, rubblization, excuse me, and seeing the various pieces. So it really does help to go there and see it and understand what's at stake here. We, as a planning commission, are an intervener in this docket, and we did file testimony, and I wanted to acknowledge our two consultants that are here today that have not been formally introduced. Well, Mr. Leach is well known, Bob Leach, and he spoke earlier. He did an analysis, which is in our testimony, on the rubblization process and the cleanup standards. And actually his report, which you can read, is, I think, supported by what we've heard today. Our other consultant is David Carpenter with FG&M law firm out of Rutland. David, and he's been assisting the town in this process, and just want to acknowledge the team that we put together here. I also wanted to point out that Vernon Planning has been working a lot on this future use of this site, and as of this Monday, we received Vernon Village was designated as a village center, and that's a formal state approval process, and that has some potential advantage, but there's a press release coming out tomorrow, thanks to Martin Langeveld, who's on our planning commission too, describing the designation and a map showing the areas of the designation, which does include the Governor Hunt House. So we do have a vision of a new village center that would be adjacent to and incorporate some existing Entergy property. And I think that's significant to show that we're working towards that goal. We also are submitting on Tuesday a grant application to the state for a municipal planning grant to develop a master plan, a conceptual master plan for that village center. Now that we've got the center, we want to take a look at what would it look like in terms of a mix of land uses, housing, residential, commercial, agricultural, industrial. The other, and I want to thank Chris Camping and his staff too for their assistance in seeking that village center designation. We also are working concurrently on an existing municipal planning grant funded that is updating our town plan, including evaluation of potential uses of the VY site. And we'd be looking at industrial development zones, a host of other incentives that might facilitate use of the site as a town and what we can do. We're somewhat, our hands are somewhat tied. We don't own any of the property. The town does not have existing zoning bylaws, but we're looking at other approaches to help facilitate reuse of the site. So I just wanted to let folks know that we're moving ahead as a town, independent and concurrently with this process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, Rich.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, panel. My name is Rich Holshoe. I am a resident of Wantastagok, Brattleboro, right here, and I am spokesperson for Elnu Abenaki, who have intervener status. I just want to kind of keep something in front of you. There's been a lot of discussion here tonight and other nights about the structures, about the waste, about the rubble. We're talking steel and concrete. Our concern, and I stated this clearly in our testimony, is the earth itself. As Indigenous people, this is our primary concern. There will be earth moved around. Mr. State has characterized the scope of their work as being much less than when the plant was built. And I understand much of the logic behind that. If you have a 50-foot deep hole in the ground, you're going to make a really big hole to get to the bottom of that. If you're only filling it in, you're going to move a lot less around. Makes sense to me. I'm okay with that. The problem is we still don't know what was disturbed originally, what is undisturbed, and that's the rub. What has been done, and I guarantee that there was cultural damage. We don't want that to increase. I want to keep that in front of the panel here, in front of the commission, and make sure that there is some solid baseline established in that regard. What's there right now, what happened in the past, what's going to happen in the future. If that is not done, say for example, this is sort of a case of closing the chicken coop when the chickens are already out. If promises are made that undisturbed soil will remain undisturbed, great. The site is then released for future use. The undisturbed soil, which is probably the more desirable parts of the lot, is going to be disturbed in future construction. Possibility of that. It will never get looked at. When this plant was built, there was never a comprehensive survey done of cultural resources, even though the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. It was never done. That's admitted by the Atomic Energy Commission. I would like to take this opportunity to take a look at that. So let's keep that in mind.
Thank you, Rich. Does anyone else have a comment? Thank you. Peter, are you? Did you have a comment? Yes.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question of the previous citizen?
Yeah.
Is part of your request that, okay, the site has been disturbed, it was never surveyed, but what has not been disturbed should be surveyed as part of this, since this is a transactional kind of situation? But you're sort of looking to catch up as much as you possibly can?
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, I would love to have this on the record.
No, thank you. It's a good question. What am I asking for? I guess that's pretty close to what I'm asking for, is a characterization of the site, what's there now. I don't think anyone really knows completely. When you dig a 50-foot deep hole with a slope going down into it, that fill went somewhere. Where did it go? What are the original contours? We don't know. I'd like to know, so that when somebody says we're not going to disturb previously undisturbed soil, how do we know? So I'm asking for a baseline survey so that there is something to refer to for accountability in the process. And this is a discussion that we are willing to have with NorthStar if this goes forward. But I just want to keep it in front of the people here tonight.
Okay, Peter.
I had a lot to say about what Rich just said, but I'm not prepared for it. It is important. I'd like to point out something which should be of interest to the town of Vernon Planning Board. Vernon has no interest in turning the Vermont Yankee site into a nature preserve. Vernon would like to benefit from an industry or a company and the jobs and taxes it would provide to the community. A word of caution. There is a difference in the level acceptable of radioactive decontamination between an industrial site and a site that's designated for release for any purpose. Release for any purpose essentially means that you can live there. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepts a radioactive decontamination to 100 millirem for an industrial site and a threshold allowable up to only 25 millirem for a release for any purpose. So what's the difference? A millirem is a very small amount of radioactivity. Radiation from the sun is a very small amount of radioactivity. Nevertheless, that tiny amount can cause cancer. According to the Beer 7 report, the 7th report of the biological effects of ionizing radiation, which is recognized by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that 0.03 millirem per year during a lifetime will equivocate to 1.5 cancer deaths in a population of 1 million people. That's very little unless you're 1 in a million. An exposure of 10 millirem per year during a lifetime will be equal to a risk of 5.7 fatal cancers in a population of only 10,000. The New England Coalition would like to decommission to 10 millirem, which was achieved at Maine Yankee, Yankee Row, and Connecticut Yankee. In fact, the state of Massachusetts has a regulation to decommission to 10 millirem. Our Vermont state is to 25 millirem. NorthStar would like to decommission to 15 millirem. Take your pick. just don't decontaminate for an industrial use. Vernon, thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Before we adjourn, I want to just update people on a couple of things. One is the meeting schedule going forward, and if everybody thought this meeting was good, you're going to want to come to our next one too. So October 26th, put that on your schedule. And I do believe, Tony, is it going to be here?
Yes, I've checked with the middle school, and
so it's here.
Both the October 26th date and the November 16 dates
Okay.
are available here. So we have to get paperwork in, but
Yep.
we're
So
penciled in
October
right now.
26th, we're definitely doing it here. The next question that we'll talk about, not tonight, is whether we're going to have a November 16th meeting, and that what I'll probably do is communicate with people via the internet, so email. So we'll keep the panel posted and the public posted. Just a quick thing, because you may hear about it. I went down yesterday or last night to Plymouth, Mass. They have their own Endicap, just like us. They asked me a lot of questions about what's going on here, and I offered on all of our behalf, and hope it was okay, that we want to be as helpful to them as we can, because we've been operating now for 3 years and as a panel, and they just started. So they may be back in touch with us. They may come here. They may ask some of us to go back down there. They also may want to collaborate with us on whether it's comments on the ANPR or things like that. But I think for good or for bad, we sort of now know what we're doing. So we can help others. And I extended that invitation to them, that we would help in any way that we can. That is the two things I wanted to make sure everybody knew about, the dates. Is there anyone else on the panel that has anything that they want to announce or ask? I can see Laura ask.
Can I just quickly ask, the site restoration standards, is that on either of the upcoming, are we revisiting or continuing that discussion on either of the upcoming agendas?
We don't have it on for October. If there's something you specifically want us to put on the agenda, we can.
Okay.
So if you think about it, I mean, it's obviously going to be something that's going to keep coming up.
Right.
But we can, any requests for agenda items. Okay. I don't think it's the last we're going to hear about the site restoration standards. Yeah. I mean, does anyone else have anything that they, oh, Tony.
One very quick item, unless someone on the panel has it. Regarding the Massachusetts Citizens Advisory Panel, the concept of Citizens Advisory Panels came up at the NRC State Liaison Officers meeting this past week, and this panel did receive a thank you from Massachusetts for its assistance in setting up the Massachusetts Handicap Panel.
We're the gold standard of panels. Yeah, Chris. Wait.
So Tony, this panel passed a resolution calling for the NRC to and other federal agencies to convene host communities to have a discussion about the rulemaking. Any chance that the NRC state liaisons might support a resolution among themselves to ask NRC to take action on that and propose legislation and make it happen?
Okay, I do need to point out that June is actually the state liaison officer. I am her designee, so I'm going to punt that up to you, June.
Thank you, Tony. That was a good career move. Chris, I really have no idea. It sounds like something that would be worth looking into, but at this time we haven't had any conversations about that.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters who came here tonight, and the state agency department staff who came here, and all the members of the public who participated. And we hope that we will see you on October 26th. Would anyone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
We have a motion to adjourn and about 5 people who have seconded it. So all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you, everybody.